Ladies and gentlemen, we'll get started in just a few moments. How many of you, for lack of a better question, how many of you are children of survivors? How many of you are survivors? Those of us who are children of survivors, and I say this all the time, we who are children of survivors are whacked. And we who are children of survivors, we know we're whacked, are well adjusted. We who are children of survivors who think we're well adjusted are really whacked. I'm a child of a survivor. My father came to the United States in 4950 on the SS Balloon into Boston. And in fact, I'm not a real believer in Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah is meaningless to me because every day for me was Yom HaShoah. Each and every day when you're a child of a survivor, it's Yom HaShoah. I'm here to tell you. Each and every day when you hear a parent have a nightmare, or when you have a parent telling you about what they went through, the 27th of Nisan is meaningless. The real question is why is the 27th of Nisan Yom HaShoah? Why? Anybody know? No one knows. You come, but you have no idea. And the reason is because you couldn't do it on Pesach. Because of the simple fact that it celebrates, so to speak, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which happened on the second day of Pesach. And you wouldn't have Yom HaShoah on Pesach. It's a joyous holiday. So the soonest time after was the 27th of Nisan. It worked out. You could have Yom HaShoah on Asar B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, when all of Jerusalem was surrounded. You could have it on Shvasar B'Tammuz on the 17th of Tammuz, when the walls of Jerusalem were breached. You could have Yom HaShoah on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, when the temples were burned to the ground. And for those of you who don't know, there's an international Holocaust Memorial Day in January. Did you know that? Mostly celebrated by non-Jews. So with all of these possibilities for Yom HaShoah, you would think that there wouldn't be any more anti-Semitism, right? I'm sorry to tell you that there has been a rise of 37% of anti-Semitism just in the past year. And it's the highest it's been since 1977. And here it is. We sit in our shul, 30, 40 people, in memory of 6 million were murdered, slaughtered, raped, pillaged, burned, all kinds of medical experiments, and you name it. And here we sit. And the atrocities are not leaving. So as we sit here today, on this Yom HaShoah, remember where you came from. You may not be a survivor. You may not be a child of a survivor. But tonight, just for this hour or so, all of us, Jews, Gentiles, and all people, are children of survivors. Remember, because only then can tonight truly have meaning for us all.
Thank you everybody for coming. I'm very happy to announce that Miriam Kapelushnik will be our speaker this evening. She is a Holocaust survivor, her parents were. So we will, can't wait to hear her presentation. She has lovely little pictures for us and everything to show us about her family. So it will be a very interesting situation. At this time, I would like to thank Susan Cantor, who worked with me to get this program together, because it was waiting till the last minute, sadly. But hopefully you will enjoy it. Sorry if this is repetitive from a prior program, but it was easier to do it this way than not have anything at all, which I think would be a shame. So I would like to start with Golden Greller, who is going to be lighting our first candle, as well as reading our first reading from our program. If you'll light the candle first. And we start at the bottom up.
We light this yellow candle to rekindle God's flame, to shine His light upon the world once again, to sanctify the memories of the millions of souls, to honor their prayers and all their lost goals. We bless their existence by being alive to light this yellow candle as proof we survived. Today, on Yom HaShoah, we remember the victims of the greatest crime of man against man, the young, the old, the innocent, the 1.5 million children, starved, shot, given lethal injections, gassed, burned, and turned to ash, because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone. What happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening? What happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image?
the thing that's different about a Virgo vacation home?
Little oaks. Yeah, that's it, little oaks. We now have members from Cologne, Susan Cantor, the president, and Dolores, and Susan Klings, and then Sabrina and Paige. And they will be doing the presentation of the quilt that they have, as well as lighting the next candle and saying prayer.
So I'm just going to introduce this. This was supposed to be a quilt turned into a wall hanging because it's going to be displayed in the showcase downstairs. The one farthest, closest to the chapel, it's the exact same size. It's going to be placed in there for display. So if you wanted to see it in the future, that's where it'll be. So that it took a turn from being a quilt to a wall hanging, and this was done by the religious school students. We finished it the week before COVID, and our display and presentation was supposed to be, I think, March 27th, and we left this building on March 21st. And so it's been in my house. We actually did present it to our congregation during Yom Kippur this year, and until then it's been there. Each student researched several children of the Holocaust, some survivors and some who didn't survive, and chose one or two to take a picture of, and then research and write the essence of their story. And then they drew it, turned it into a picture on oak tag, and then we changed it into the fabric that is adhesive, and then Sabrina came up with this good idea that we should put wire all the way around, but we knew that I would probably be the one to kill myself with it. So this is it looks like wire, but it's a yarn. Since most of the children who have done this have been bar mitzvah and graduated and left, except the girls who are still here, thank God. So we are going to just read one or two that we each have done. We did one, our rabbi did one square. I think Sabrina, you've done 2 or 3 or 4, and you did, also I did 2. So we're going to present that now. We called it Never Again because our Holocaust study runs for about 3 months and every year, and it's a very tight unit. It's very difficult. It's just emotionally wrenching, and so the kids did everything. Dolores and I did the ironing. So yay. And we did the gluing. Yeah. So if there's a problem with the gluing, that's our fault. Sabrina, do you want to start?
Sure. The main person I focused on was a young girl named Ruth Frunweiser. She was born in 1926, and she lived with 2 parents in Prague, Czechoslovakia. In 1933, she was in her 2nd year of secondary school. In 1939, the Nazis started putting restrictions on what Jewish people could do in Prague, and that meant she had to sacrifice her education, and her education stopped for her at the age of 13, and that was also when her normal life came to an end. In late 1944, she was deported to Auschwitz on a labor transport, and she very narrowly missed death, where she was almost gassed. But on the day where she was supposed to be gassed, she was put on a 2nd labor transport and deported to another concentration camp, where shortly after she was liberated by American troops. She went back to Prague after she was liberated, and she was the only survivor of her family, unfortunately.
You want to tell everybody what this is, because this is just a representation.
This one was a drawing of what the prisoner uniform looked like for a lot of people who were put in the concentration camps at the time. The photo that I referenced from was featured at a ceremony of remembrance.
Hi, mine is over here. Her name was Paula Weisman, and she was born in Poland in 1928. Unfortunately, They were found in a bunker and they were deported to Auschwitz. And unfortunately, her entire family, including herself, was murdered in the camp before it was liberated.
Mine is actually right here, English Shear. She was born January 11th, 1930. She was from Vienna, Austria. She actually survived and immigrated to the U.S. and lived in Brussels during World War II. And then in Brussels, she attended Catholic school. I guess that's how she survived through it, and lived there until the end of the war.
I did a few here, but the one I think that is probably the most meaningful to all of us is here, which is Pesach Langer, who is Rabbi Langer's father. This photograph actually was a detail in a picture that the rabbi found where his father was in Stalag 325 in right. So I actually did a little research on the computer to find a little more about him. The rabbi wasn't that much of a help. So I'll just tell you, he was sent to Stalag 325, a Nazi camp in Rava-Ruska in the Lvov region. After the camp's liberation by the Russians, he was sent to a DP camp in Bamberg, Bavaria, Germany. He survived the Holocaust with 2 of his 7 siblings. Later, he immigrated to America, to Boston, in 1950. And he and his wife, Dell, had 3 children, one of whom you all know. That was the most meaningful one I did. We're going to put this back on the piano so that you can see it when we finish. You can walk around. I think it was a really wonderfully meaningful way for kids to identify with the Holocaust by identifying with 1, 2, or 3 children of their age, instead of just talking about millions, which really doesn't mean much to anybody when you talk about millions. What does that really mean? But when you can talk about millions and know 2 or 3 people, histories, families, the dogs that they owned, the places that they went. So this was a very nice project. I was very pleased. The kids did a great job. Thank you. Oh, now, Paige, you're going to do.
I'm gonna get the.
No, second reading. Susan.
Yes, why? You said you wanted to do this.
They're going to say. Oh, they're going to say. Okay.
We're lighting the second candle for the 1.5 million children who died during the Holocaust.
We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened, and to the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at the risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope.
Dr. Bertstein, did you do the candle and light that meeting?
So my mother and her family escaped Germany and went to Shanghai. And there they lived in the ghetto for 11 years before they came to the United States by way of San Francisco and ultimately ended up in New York. Today on Yom HaShoah, we call on you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder. Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Do not oppress the strangers.
Mr. Mills, please.
Fourth reading, what we lost, the parents and grandparents, the children, the teachers, the rabbis, the culture of so many years.
The painting that will never be painted, the sculpture that will never be formed.
The poem that will never be written, the song that will never be sung, the music that will never be heard, the cure that is yet to be found, the device that was never invented.
We know that whilst we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future.
We know that whilst we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live on and that their deaths were not in vain.
Thank you. Harry and Sandy? Stop.
You're all that are left of a multitude of people who, without clothes to protect themselves, march proudly to their death, never uttering their fears, only the sacred words of prayer. We are the survivors. They never knew the horror of the death camp, the smell of gas, reaching open nostrils, the point of a gun on barely covered bones, and the doom that a pair of black boots brought.
We never saw our families taken away in trains, never to return, or fall bleeding and dead in open pits, knowing that we would join them shortly. We never experienced the pain, but 6 million did, and their sacred memory we must never allow ourselves to forget. My father was a Holocaust survivor. His whole family perished. He had 3 brothers, a sister, and parents, and I'm very proud that he was able to survive, and I keep telling my family all about him and his family. We miss him very much.
My father lost 2 sisters. He was born in 1910, and I really had grandparents who were parents. And most people who were survivors were much, much younger. It was really, most people of his generation did not survive. And he lost a sister. What I do remember is right after the war, it must have been about 6 or 7, one of the sisters that survived had bullet holes in her arms the size of silver dollars. That I remember to this very day.
Thank you. Rabbi and Ken? Okay, continue.
When Isaac was bound on the altar, Abraham replied, "Hineni, I am here, so that abominable sacrifices would be no more. Like Isaac, they were unknowingly and unwittingly bound, so the abominations of murderous oppressions should end. Israel was chosen to your service, that the word of Torah could go forth from Zion and Jerusalem. The suffering was great, still we are here. And so on this Yom HaShoah, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yizkor, remember. May the souls of the victims be bound in the bond of everlasting life.
Amen.
In the month of Nisan, there are normally not any Malei Rachamim done. Only during Yizkor service on the 8th day of Pesach. But from Pesach, the second night, through Shavuot, 49 days, the life of the Jew is a roller coaster. From Passover, the height of freedom, and Yizkor comes on day 8. And then Yom HaShoah. And we're in the Sfirat HaOmer and the counting of the Omer, and we get to Lag BaOmer. And we have bonfires and barbecues. And we celebrate an end to the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva dying. During that time, we have Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for fallen soldiers of Israel. And following Yom HaZikaron is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. The life of the Jew is a roller coaster. It has been a roller coaster from the time of Abraham. And it will continue to be a roller coaster until the coming of the Mashiach. And he comes soon. I choose to do a mole on Yom HaShoah for the Holocaust victims. For in fact, it's not just a day in Nisan. I ask that you please rise. Malei Rachamim, Dayan Almanot, Vavitonim, Al na techeseh, ותתאפק לדם ישראל, שנשפך כמים. המצר מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושם וטהרם כזוהר הרקיע מאירים ומעשירים ונשמותיהם של רבבות אלפי ישראל, הנשים ונשים, ילדים וילדות, שנהרגו ושנשחטו, ושנשרפו, ונחנקו, ונקברו חיים בארצות אשר נגעה בהם יד הצורר הגרמני וגירורה. כולם קדושים וטהורים ובהם גאונים וצדיקים. ארזי הלבנון, אדירי התורה. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם, לכן ברחמים יסתירם בסד כנפיו ילמם, בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ונפו ושלום המשכבותיהם. God full of mercy, justice of widows, Father of orphans, please do not be silent and hold your peace for the blood of Israel that is shed like water. Grant fitting rest on the wings of the divine presence, in the heights of the holy and the pure, who shine and radiate light like the radiance of heaven itself. To the souls of the millions of Jews, men, women, and children who were murdered, slaughtered, burned, strangled, and buried alive. In the lands touched by the Nazi enemies and their followers. They were all holy and pure. Among them were scholars, righteous individuals, cedars of Lebanon, nobles, noble masters of Torah. May the Garden of Eden be their resting place. Master of compassion, shelter them in the shadow of your wings forever, and bind their souls to the bond of everlasting life. The Lord is their heritage. May they rest in peace. And we say, Amen. Amen. You may be seated. I have the honor of introducing Miriam Kapelushnik. I tease her often. I love her name. It rolls off the tongue. Kapelushnik.
Not exactly.
I've had the opportunity to get to know Miriam a bit in the past 4 years. And I look forward to hearing her story as much as I'm sure you do.
short. While we hear of many Holocaust survivors who never talked about their experiences, I have to say that my mother did talk about some of them. She talked about her family in Poland, how they lived, how a dish was prepared, things they said. Unfortunately, the stories she told about her life in the ghetto and in the concentration camp were so horrific that I've repressed many of them. My father never talked about his past or his experiences. He died when I was only 17, so I never got to ask him the questions that I had over the years. Along with my family stories, I will present a historical backdrop of what was going on. Because I didn't know a lot specifically about my father's, I did a lot of research. And it was very cathartic to research all of this. So, I never knew any of my grandparents and 11 of my aunts and uncles. I could have had a very large family, but I only had a small one. My mother was the 7th child out of 8 in her family. Let's do the first photograph. This is a picture I have of most of my mother's family. They are my grandfather, Mordechai, also known as Reb Knuckle, my grandmother, Hannah, born Mochovnik and then became Kapelushnik, that was the family name, Kapelushnik. And the children, Moshe, Hinda, Leibel, Shimon, Chuma, and Bluma, the baby. I think someone wrote her name in there, so we knew. Bluma was the baby. My mother, Rachela, and my uncle, Yisrael, were not born yet. The only survivors of my mother's family were the 3 youngest children. My Aunt Bluma, baby in the picture, my mother, and my Uncle Solik. I have only one picture of my father's family members. He was one of 7 brothers and the only one in his entire immediate family to survive. That's him on the bottom, second from the right. That's my dad. His parents' names were Benjamin, Phil, and Miriam, for whom I am named. I do not even know the names of his brothers. Okay, my mother and father were both born in a village, a shtetl, called Bieszczyn in Polish and Bezoin in Yiddish. They knew each other as children, as my father was my mother's oldest brother's best friend. Although I don't know much about my father's family, my mother would tell me that her father had a longer beard than my father's father. So therefore, he had more yichus, which is pedigree or bragging rights, if you will. My mother's parents had a business in the shtetl, a lumber yard, and they were comfortable. They lived a normal Hasidic life in the shtetl. It was a busy household, as you can imagine, with 8 kids. On Fridays, people brought a big pot of chulin to the bakery in the middle of the town to cook. As my mother was the youngest girl, it was her job to take a wagon and bring home the hot chulin on Shabbat while the men and boys were in shul, so they can have a hot meal when they returned home. After several years, a competitor opened another lumber yard, and the competition affected the family's business to the point where they became poor and could not make ends meet. When my mother was 10 years old, the family moved to the big city of Lodz,
for better opportunities. Life was a struggle. Several years ago, I went to Poland to retrace my family's life with my uncle Słodek and one of his sons with his wife. My mother, no.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Go ahead.
My mother always spoke about the mistreatment by the Polish people and never considered going back to Poland for any reason. So I never really thought about going there either. However, when I heard that my uncle was going, I felt that if I didn't go with him, I would miss the opportunity of hearing some family stories. I learned from my uncle that the family had a little grocery store in Lodz, which my mother, as a young girl, was basically running so that other family members could find other jobs. Once they moved to Lodz, my mother had to stop going to school, which she loved. When they were in the shtetl, I believe she went to a public school as she continued into her advanced age to recite poetry in Polish that she learned in school. As far as I know, she never went to school once they moved to Lodz at the age of 10. So my mother had a 5th grade education, but she was one of the smartest people I have ever known. Till her dying day, she was able to speak, understand, and read 4 languages fluently: Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, and English, as well as understanding other European languages. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and then came the decree that created ghettoization and affected every Jew in Lodz. My mother told of how the Germans came to their home and said, "You have to move out of here and go down the road or across the street, because that's where all the Jews will be living." And that's how the ghetto started. That building where they lived is now gone, and in its place is a modern shopping mall. Within a month or two, all Jews, numbering about 175,000, even though many had already fled, were required to live in an area of barely 1.5 square miles. Lodz was one of the very first of the 200 ghettos set up by the invaders, and it was the harshest and longest lasting ghetto. The Germans changed the name of the city to Litzmannstadt. The Germans demolished all the houses around the boundary, creating a kind of no man's land between the barbed wire and the world outside of it. The Lodz ghetto received no mail, newspapers, or packages from the outside world. There was no telephone or telegraph contact, and possession of a radio was a capital crime. A German patrol guard patrolled the perimeter with orders to shoot any Jew for merely approaching the fence. As a result, hundreds were killed, whether they were trying to escape or not. The Germans removed Jews from all over, from Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and sent them to the Lodz ghetto, making it even more crowded. They lived under the vise of hunger and deprivation. Work, drudgery, and the struggle to survive dominated life in the ghetto. It was, in fact, an urban slave labor camp. All existence depended on the continued ability to supply the Germans with goods for the war effort. My mother said she worked with many other girls at long tables making shoes for the German soldiers out of straw. The train station in Lodz, from where the Jews were deported, has now been turned into a museum, which I visited. When I was there, they had pictures all over the wall, and I saw pictures of exactly that. Girls and young women sitting at long tables with piles of straw on the ground near them. I pored over these pictures trying to see if one of them was my mother, but I didn't find her picture there. Disease and starvation were rampant. In 1941 alone, over 2,000 Lodz Jews died of starvation. In 1942, the rate of starvation more than doubled from the year before. It was the leading cause of death. My aunt wrote something once on how you could see people, really skeletons, walking on the street, and a moment later they were dead on the pavement. The Germans provided food by rations. The food distribution lines were so long that they often lasted into the middle of the night. The people, being so hungry and weak, would wait on those long lines till 2 or 3 in the morning to get their rations, and then have to be back at work at 6 or 7 in the morning. There were different food ration coupons based on the work you did. A B ration was a regular food coupon. L ration was for workers putting in long shifts, Langarbeiter. S ration was for doing hard physical labor, Schwerarbeiter. N ration for those working at night, Nachtarbeiter. In September 1942, the Germans demanded that the ghetto surrender for deportation 15,000 Jews under the age of 10 and over 65, in addition to the sick and infirm. Some parents tried to hide their children, others tried to bribe the authorities. Those who simply refused to part with their offspring were shot on the spot. My mother recalled this event vividly. The German soldiers came through the building, knocking loudly on the door, yelling, "Aros! Aros! Everybody out!" When all the people from the building were outside in the courtyard, they separated, some to the right, some to the left. My grandmother and grandfather were ordered to the left, while my mother, my aunt, and my uncle to the right. Several of the older children were already either married or out of the house. My uncle, being a young boy, hiding behind his sister's skirts, started whimpering. One German soldier heard him and said, "Who is that?" as my uncle started running away into the building. The soldier chased him and kept looking for him throughout the building until finally he gave up, as my uncle was hiding under a bed. When I went to Poland with my uncle, standing in the courtyard of that building, which was now abandoned, I shuddered as my uncle told the same exact story about what happened to him as my mother had told me. After the war, the truth became known that the Germans trucked these deportees to the killing center at Chelmno, or some say Majdanek. Here they were stripped of their clothing and valuables, loaded into rudimentary gas vans, and asphyxiated by carbon dioxide poisoning. It was the last time my mother saw her parents. Of the Jews remaining in Lodz, nearly every one of them had a child or parent among the victims of this deportation. Over the next few years, there were many other deportations, which the residents of the ghetto feared, as they never knew when they would happen or who would be deported or what the deportees were facing. Life in the ghetto was a constant struggle to maintain strength in the face of mounting despair. The ghetto remained a major manufacturing center for the Germans for almost 2 more years. By the spring of 1944, with the Red Army only 90 miles away, Berlin made the decision to liquidate Lodz Jewry while it still had the opportunity. Thousands of Jews were deported by train to Chelmno and gassed to death there. But in August, over 67,000 Jews were put on trains to Auschwitz, where most were killed within hours of arrival. They were deported in closed wagons that herded in 100 or more people into each cattle car. They had no water or food. The transport was on the move for 1 week till they arrived in Auschwitz. I believe that is when my mother arrived in Auschwitz. I really always thought that my mother was in Auschwitz until liberation, but I just recently found out by reading over some paperwork she had filled out that she was only in Auschwitz for a month or so, and then was sent to a concentration camp called Bad Kudova, where she was incarcerated and worked until liberation in May of 1945. When my daughter was in middle school, one of her classes was learning about the Holocaust or reading a book about it. Dina, my daughter, mentioned that her grandmother was a Holocaust survivor and was in Auschwitz. The teacher reached out to my mother and asked her to share her story. This was very difficult for my mother, but she felt it was an important thing to do. I'd like to read to you the letter she wrote. My mother was in Florida at the time, and obviously my daughter was in Freehold. So she wrote a letter. To Miss Carrie Zerko, I think that was the teacher's name. It's hard for me to write about the Holocaust because I don't know where to begin. My youth was cut off. My life was shattered. These are the stories I have to offer to my children and my grandchildren. This is a sad story of human brutality and the Holocaust history of my people. I was a teenager, my granddaughter's age, when the Germans closed us in a ghetto, all my family and all the Jews. A ghetto is a place where you are isolated from freedom with very little food. We suffered hunger, insults, and beatings from the brutal Germans. Many Jews were tortured and killed daily. After 3 years of suffering in the ghetto, the Germans closed up the streets, called down all the people from the house. They picked the older and the disabled, ordered them to go to the left, the rest of us to the right. This was my first horrible experience. When clinging to my mother's dress, they pulled her and my father away forever. We were left, went to the house, and cried bitterly. The rumors were that these people are going to the gas chambers. After a year or so, the ghetto people were sent in big groups to concentration camps. They packed us in the hundreds in closed-up wagons with no food and no toilet. We arrived with all the others in Auschwitz. Men were separated from women, children from mothers. They brought us into a hall where we were ordered to take off all our clothes. I have seen big boxes overflowing with gold earrings, watches, jewelry, ripped off human beings. Even gold teeth were pulled out of people's mouths. They gave us striped dresses, shaved our heads, and sent us to the barracks. Every day we were standing naked in front of the German officers for segregation. The ones that were taken away were sent to the gas chambers. This horror was with us every day. How could human beings do this? After a short time, they sent us to work. This was a new chapter in my young life. With no food, sometimes very little food, we were marched for miles to the factory in wooden clogs. I was working by aeroplane parts all night. I have to tell you of the tortures we lived through so people will have an idea who the Germans were. We were hungry. The German instructor gathered us in for an hour of lectures, orientation about the machines. While teaching, he was eating apples, salamis, and all kinds of food that irritates our appetite. This was going on for the entire hour. These are the horrors that I went through, and this is only a small part of it. She signed Rochelle Schwartz. I have to say, my mother told me that she kept this very mild because she knew that the children who were hearing this had no concept of anything like this, and it would be too horrifying to really say more. But that's what my mother wrote in her words. After liberation, my mother made her way back to Lodz and started to regain her strength. Many Jews who returned to their homes found that their home had been taken over by Polish people. Many Jews were killed because of this. The Polish people didn't want the Jews to have their home back. As our guide told us when I was in Poland with my uncle, the feeling of resentment was, oh, my Jew had to come back. Why did my Jew have to come back? So, my Aunt Bluma had been sent during the war to different concentration camps and finally to a labor camp in Germany. She was liberated in Germany and after liberation was in a displaced person camp which was provided by the United Nations Relief Organization. She had been married while in the ghetto and once reunited with her husband, who had been liberated from Austria, they emigrated to the United States. Bluma became Barbara. My uncle Schleimer became Saul, although we always called them Bluma and Schleimer. My uncle Slulik was sent to several different labor camps during the war, and a few months after liberation, he made his way back to Lodz, found his sister, my mother, and said, "What are we going to do now?" My mother said, "We're going to Israel," which was then called Palestine. "I've already made arrangements. You'll join me. We leave next week." They left Poland and stayed in Italy for about 2 months. My mother always smiled when she spoke about her time in Italy. Now would be the time for that photo.
Oh, wrong one.
Yeah, that's my mother right there. She's smiling. I have a couple of pictures of her time in Italy. It's always big groups of people and they all seem happy. She was a young woman and she was free. In Italy, she introduced herself as Raffaella, but the Italians called her Raffaella. She loved that. From Italy, my mother and her brother, together with other survivors, then traveled to Israel on an illegal boat. They arrived on the shores of Israel in the middle of the night and, under cover of darkness, were carried on the backs of the Palmachim to a kibbutz. Now my father's story. That's how my mom got to Israel. Okay, now my father's story. As I said, my father died when I was only 17, so I didn't get much information before that. His name at birth was Hanoch Hill. He was a learned man, having gone to seminary. He was a quiet, well-respected man by all who knew him. An idle mensch, a gentle man. I know he was in the Polish army fighting against the Germans, but not much else. However, the only thing he had from before or after the war was a beautifully engraved silver cigarette case, which I cherish because here it is, beautifully engraved. And inside, when you open it up, it's a cigarette case, and inside is engraved his name, H. Chil, Tehran, and the 20th of the 5th month, 1942. In those days they used to write the month with a Roman numeral. So it's 20/V/1942. I always wondered, why was the Polish army in Iran? And how did he get to Iran? When I was in Poland with my uncle, I asked him about it, as he was very close with my father. He started to explain that my father was in the Polish army of a specific general, but he couldn't remember his name. Our Polish guide, who overheard the conversation, said, "Oh, was it General Anders?" He was familiar with Polish history as he studied it in school. Our guide actually grew up in the town of Auschwitz. So my uncle said, yes, that's who it was, General Anders. I was left with the task of finding out more. Okay, next. So, in September of 1939, a non-aggression pact was made between Germany and Russia, which divided Poland into two parts, the western part German and the eastern part Soviet. Soon after the Soviets annexed eastern Poland, they began capturing and deporting Poles to remote areas of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, Polish soldiers as well as civilians. These Poles were sent to labor camps where they lived under brutal and deplorable conditions, freezing weather, without proper clothing, tortured and starved. Although most of these Poles were not Jews, there were several thousand who were. They were not considered ethnic Poles, but were identified instead as the Jews. In June 1941, Germany broke the non-aggression pact and invaded eastern Poland, smashing through Soviet defenses. The Soviets attempted to organize a Polish unit in the Red Army as they needed a bigger fighting force. A new Polish army was formed with General Anders at the command. This Polish army was subordinate to the Polish government in exile, which was located in London. The Poles, soldiers and civilians, including General Anders, who had been detained in labor camps, were granted amnesty. The camps were opened up and many who had been detained were free to go. Most had no money or supplies, but all headed south to find the Polish army for protection. The trekkers suffered from extreme exhaustion, dysentery, frostbite. Disease and epidemics were rampant. The Polish army grew in numbers as more and more reached General Anders' position and joined. The Soviets were supposed to supply half of this Polish army with food, uniforms, and weapons, and the Western Allies were to supply the other half. Oh, what I forgot to say, I just realized I forgot to say that once Germany broke the non-aggression pact, that made Stalin and the Soviets more aligned with the Western Allies, okay? So the Polish army, the Soviets were supposed to supply half of this Polish army with food, uniforms, and weapons, and the Western Allies were supposed to supply the other half. British supplies and uniforms began to arrive in November 1941. The Soviets wanted to reduce General Anders' strength and limit the numbers in his army, so Stalin said he was only going to provide food and materials for about 30,000. The Soviets were continually cutting back food rations and supplies. So, by the spring of 1942, General Anders and the Polish High Command in London decided to evacuate the Polish forces from Soviet territory to British-held Persia, Iran. Over the next few months, they reached Iran either by sea, via the Caspian Sea, or overland in trucks. Out of about 130,000 evacuated out of the USSR, about 35 to 4,500 Jewish soldiers, and from 2,500 to 3,500 Jewish civilians left the USSR with Anders' army. I can only surmise that my father was one of them. So I finally found out how and why my father was in Tehran. Oh, next picture. So here's a picture that was a group. My father is the one all the way on the right, and a group of other Polish soldiers. Oh, I'm going to take out that picture. Where's my envelope with the pictures? Oh, I wanted to read the names. He wrote the names. Someone wrote the names of all these. I did have it here. Got my pictures in an envelope. Where did it go? Let me see. Oh, here it is. So yeah, I wanted to just kind of read the names. I'm going to be saying names because I think it's important to say names to help remember them. So this is the picture, and these are the names that were written. And this also was dated the 18th of the 5th month, 1942. So all the way to the right is my father, Hanoch Hill, and it's written here where they're from. He was from Poland. Then there's Moshe Mizrahi Oren. Oh, no, he's from Iran. He's from Iran. Naftali Bergman from Poland, from Krakow. Yosef Skelonsky from Poland, from Warsaw. Baruch Gendler from Poland. Shifra Gendler from Poland. I guess that's the husband and wife. This might have been even their wedding, for all I know. And Shimon ben Aaron Astan, he was from India, from Bombay. This guy right here. How he got into the Polish army, I don't know. Okay. Another person who was in this army, a name you might recognize, was Menachem Begin, who later headed the Irgun and also became the 6th Prime Minister of Israel. Iran was not friendly to the Polish army, as they had been occupied by British and Soviet forces since August of 1941. So several months later, the army was transported to Iraq, which also was not friendly to the Poles for the same reason. The Polish army then moved to Palestine, also under British occupation. There were many deserters from the Polish army of Jewish soldiers. About 2/3 of all the Jewish soldiers deserted. Many of them joined the Irgun or the Haganah. These were paramilitary organizations that many of them worked underground before the State of Israel was established. So many of these deserters joined the Irgun or the Haganah and hid in kibbutzim, where they were needed to work and protect against Arab attacks and even from the British. I would venture to guess that my father also was involved in the Irgun or the Haganah, although I have no evidence of this. As I said, I don't know details of my father's arrival in Israel, but I know he was in the Polish army and he was in Iran, so the pieces fit. And I know that being a strong Zionist, once he got to the Middle East, he deserted. He said, I'm so close to Israel, I'm going. He and a few of his friends just left. My father's name, as I said, was Hanoch Hill. Since he went AWOL from the army and didn't want them to find him, he changed his last name to Benyamini, from his father's name, Benjamin. So that's how he got to Israel. Okay. Now, there were centers in Tel Aviv where people coming from all over Europe could register their names and see if anyone had arrived from their hometown or that they knew. My mother and father both went repeatedly to check the list. When my father heard that someone from Bezoin had arrived, he returned to the center daily until he reunited with my mother. As I said earlier, he was my mother's oldest brother's best friend, so they knew each other. It was a happy reunion after many, many years. So my parents married in 1948 and had 2 children. When I was born, my name was Miriam Benyamini, but I was called Mira. My brother was Mordechai Benyamini, but we call him Moti. My uncle Sulek also married in Israel, and after having 1 son, his family emigrated to the U.S. where they had 2 more children. With my mother's closest relatives, her only 2 surviving siblings, living in the U.S., my parents also decided to emigrate to the U.S. My mother started taking English lessons. Oh, do the next picture, yeah.
Yes.
With the quota system in place, my mother had to come 6 months before the rest of us, as she had blood relatives here to sponsor her. So this is a picture of my family just before my mother left for America. That's me. My father, brother, and I arrived 6 months later after a 10-day boat ride across the Atlantic Ocean via Zim passenger ship, which no longer exists. When we arrived, my mother had a job and an apartment with furniture all ready for us in Brooklyn. After 5 years, we became naturalized citizens of the United States. My father wanted his original family name, Chil, back. He wanted his family name back. Since there is no ch sound in English, Chil became Hill. Hanoch Benjamini became Henry Hill. Rachel Benjamini became Rochelle Hill. All of our names changed officially from Benjamini to Hill. Our life in the United States was not a typical American life, as many of my friends had. I always say we lived more like a European or an Israeli family. The languages spoken in our house were mostly Hebrew and Yiddish, although my parents often spoke Polish when they didn't want us to understand. Of course, I picked up on some keywords to figure out who or what they were talking about. A typical sentence in my house could have 4 different languages in it. Everyone I knew growing up was a Holocaust survivor. My parents had a wonderful group of friends who all spoke Hebrew, Yiddish, and Polish, and all survived the Holocaust. There was Buri and Malta, Leah and Shimon, Esther and Yitzchak, Leah and Nisim, Marta and Munya, Bella and David. They would get together just about every weekend at each other's homes to play cards, share simchas, share stories, have a good time. There was always a lot of food and a lot of laughter. I always marveled. Is there another picture? Oh, yeah. I always marveled at how my parents and all their friends, in fact, all survivors, have moved past the horrors they experienced to lead mostly happy, productive lives. I'm continually in awe of their ability to do that. You can show the last picture. That's just a picture of my family in Brooklyn. After we all look, everybody's
About that, right?
Huh? Yeah. It must have been some occasion we were all dressed up going somewhere else. So my research is not complete. I know that my father registered all of my mother's relatives at Yad Vashem in Israel when it was just being built. This is a Holocaust memorial in Israel that is quite moving. If you ever get to Israel, I know some of you have been, it is a must-see. I have not yet contacted Yad Vashem to find out more information about my father's family, but preparing for this presentation has motivated me to continue my research. Thank you for listening.
Start the moment of silence in memory of them.
Okay. We'll now have a moment of silence. Should all stand for Hatikvah.
Justin Karen, if you would come up and do the York site and the last candle. I don't remember. This thing.
The soul is attached to the body, much as the flame is a part of the candle. It burns brightly for but a moment, and then in a single instant it is gone. We remember the soul of all who died, Al Kadush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. We will keep the flame of their memory burning brightly, for they are ever a part of us. May their soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life, and their memory forever be a blessing.
Thank you, everyone.